Welcome to the Korea Society's Arts and Culture program. 2022 FIFA World Cup tournament has officially kicked off. Every 4 years, the world's attention is focused on this tournament where world-famous soccer players are pitted against each other while representing their home country. This event can define and elevate even the most elite soccer players' career, and the game can send millions of people around the world into either ecstasy or agony. The Republic of Korea is one of 32 countries participating in this 21st FIFA World Cup in Qatar. This is their 11th and 10th consecutive appearance at this tournament. Republic of Korea actually holds the proud distinction of being the first independent Asian country to participate in the FIFA World Cup tournament back in 1954. But Korea's success in soccer is forever linked with the 2002 World Cup. While co-hosting the tournament with Japan, Korea became the first team outside of Europe and America to reach the semifinals. That event propelled Korea to the next stage in the world of soccer as it became a home of world-class players, a robust professional soccer league, and the most dedicated fans. Here to talk about Korea and the FIFA World Cup is journalist Steve Han. I know this is a very busy time for you as a journalist focusing on soccer. So thank you so much for taking your time to join us tonight.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having me. You said it right there. I mean, every 4 years, the world turns their attention to the World Cup. So every 4 years, I just get a little bit of that attention towards me.
Great. So let's talk about soccer in Korea. Do we have any idea when and how soccer was introduced to Korea?
Yeah, I mean, there are so many like legendary stories about how, you know, as a starter, like there's the story about how the British Navy left a soccer ball at a harbor in Incheon in the late 19th century, and that's what really got the ball rolling. There's a legendary story on that. And, you know, like, I guess, but in terms of soccer in its modern form, you know, surprisingly enough, there was an organized, competitive nationwide league in Korea way back in the day, called 전조선 축구대회, which roughly translates to all Korean football tournament, I guess. That it ran from 1921, I want to say 1921 to 1940, so for about 2 decades. You know, and given Korea's situation at the time, it obviously wasn't a professional league, but, you know, the teams, it was pretty much like operated like a professional league almost, because, you know, the teams would represent various cities like Seoul and Pyongyang and schools and even Buddhist temples. And which, you know, I guess presumably, I think it played a big factor in Korea's national soccer team qualifying for the Olympics for the first time in 1948. Like, can you imagine in the 40s, Korea competing at the Olympics playing soccer? And, you know, they actually went there and managed to win a game over Mexico, which is quite impressive given the circumstances at the time for Korea. And then they went on to qualify for the World Cup, like you said, for the first time in 1954. And they went over there and they lost 9-0 to Hungary and 7-0 to Turkey. But still, you know, considering the situation in Korea at the time, it's pretty much somewhat of a miracle that they even got there.
Do you have a sense how popular soccer was in Korea? I mean, there's just the fact that they were playing it and
Right.
There was a league means that people were interested in. But why do you think people were so interested in soccer of all the sports?
You know, you look back, you know, during the Japanese occupation of Korea, and also there's the fact that they actually had this league in Korea for 2 decades, spanning 2 decades from 1920s to 1940s. Based on what I've read, there are no videos of this, so you can't really see what actually happened. But based on what I've read, that league was immensely popular in Korea, and especially when it was a game between a team representing Seoul and a team representing Pyongyang. I heard that the games were pretty much like, you know, Europeans like to call it derbies. You know, we hear about the Manchester Derby with Manchester United, Manchester City. We hear about, you know, El Clasico with Real Madrid and Barcelona. So it probably wasn't to that scale, but it was something of a derby game in Korea, which is very interesting. You know, I think if if a video of that game was available anywhere, I think anybody would love to see that. But based on what I've heard, it was immensely popular, the soccer league, the nationwide league in Korea. And also, I guess you hear a lot of these stories around the world as well. For countries that were colonized in the past, soccer was pretty much the only, well, maybe not the only, but it was the sport where people can actually gather and really just feel sort of like a sense of belonging. You know what I mean? Because, Koreans, we're talking about a time when Koreans pretty much felt like they lost their country. And to have not a professional league, but to actually have an organized competitive league there and the country going to the Olympics and stuff like that. So when you look at it from that standpoint, it was obviously a very fascinating story.
And you mentioned the Buddhist monks. So what was all that story all about?
I wish I knew more, to be honest with you, but these are all based on the things that I've read in the past. I kind of feel like, when we go to even, like Korean Americans, when we go to a church, we have that, in Korean, you call it like 청년부, 대학부 and things like that, where, you have your peers and whatnot, and you have your little circle of friends and clubs and whatnot, I guess. And I guess it was one of those because based on what I've read, these teams that represented Buddhist temples they were called like 불교 청년부 and things like that, 청년회, or however they called it at the time. So I feel like it was probably young people who are attending Buddhist temples. It could have been monks, who knows? I wish I knew more, to be honest with you, but these are just little stories that are coming out, so I really do wish I knew more, but I kind of feel like it was amongst people who were attending Buddhist temples at the time.
And since this is not necessarily quote unquote traditional Korean form of sports,
sure, what
do you think was sort of the image of soccer as a sport? Because nowadays we carry all this, if you're playing American football versus basketball or baseball, there are all these stereotypical images that is attached to sports itself. Do we have any idea of what soccer meant to Koreans?
Yeah, no, obviously, I wasn't there, but I can pretty much guarantee you that it was played on dirt because that's the way it was when I was growing up in the 90s and going to school in Korea. So it probably wasn't a grass field. And those, quote unquote stadiums probably didn't have stands for the fans to sit on. So it was probably just a crowd of people gathering around a dirt field, probably, which is just like the way it was when I was attending school in the 90s. So you could only imagine what it looked like back in the 20s and 30s and 40s. So yeah, I mean, I think that's the only idea that I can draw, because I wish there were more photos and videos of these games, but which is a pity that it's not very well documented. But yeah, I can imagine it was probably played on dirt field, and the rest, I'm honestly, I'm not sure.
So somehow Korea managed to go to World Cup in 1954, where they were, didn't win anything. And then it took a long time for Korea to make another World Cup appearance on the main tournament, because there are always the qualifying leagues or qualifying games before you get to the main one, until 1986. So there was a long period of time when they were trying to go to the World Cup. And we will focus mostly about South Korea today, but I think we have to mention a little bit about what happened in 1966 World Cup.
Sure. Yeah, that's obviously remembered as one of the most legendary underdog stories in World Cup history, and not just amongst Koreans. North Korea was actually one of the stronger Asian teams in this sport in the 60s, 70s, and the 80s. Because when it comes to extreme training methodologies, to be fit, to be able to outrun, outwork, and outpace your opponents, North Korea was second to no one at the time. And to highlight just how much of a historic achievement 1966 was for North Korea, I work with FIFA's editorial team, and we were publishing 100 most important storylines in the history of the World Cup leading up to this tournament. And North Korea's win over Italy in 1966 was one of the top stories. And that World Cup, it was hosted by England, and in the city of Middlesbrough, and that was the city that hosted all three of North Korea's group games. And there are still people who remember the North Korean team and the players, like people who are from Middlesbrough. Park Do-ik, who was the star player for North Korea at the time, he apparently became something of a legend in Middlesbrough because of his winning goal versus Italy, which is quite interesting. But like now with sports science being what it is, and how things like quantitative analysis, statistical analysis, and things like that to improve the performance levels of the players, it's obviously become very difficult for Korea to keep up and find their footing again in world soccer, given how isolated they are.
But they did have that moment, and then South Korea started to make their appearances on World Cup. Do we call that the main tournament, or after the qualifying, or the World Cup tournament, I guess?
So the qualifying phase, we usually call it World Cup qualifying. And, those obviously get broken into regions. So you call it, soccer fans would just automatically understand if you put it this way, but they'll call it Asian qualifying, European qualifying, South African qualifying. And the actual tournament, like the one that's happening right now, we call it the World Cup or the World Cup finals.
So South Korea started to make their appearance on World Cup finals in 1986. And they were never very, very successful, but they always made a try. So can you give us a sort of a brief summary of their appearances in 1986, and then I would guess 99, 94, and 98?
Sure. If I were to just to summarize it a little bit, I guess this is one of the most interesting periods in Korean football, between 1986 to 1998, just before the 2002 World Cup. And we all know what happened in 2002, obviously. And, I grew up as a big soccer fan, and I lived through this period in Korea, as a kid. And at the time, the Koreans perceived this game completely different from how we perceive it right now. Because nowadays, we look forward to weekends to watch Korea's biggest, soccer players play in the biggest European leagues. But back in those days, Korean soccer player playing against the world's best players in the world's best leagues, it was almost unthinkable. And obviously there was Cha Bum-gun, who was a legendary player who had a legendary career in Germany in the 80s. But I mean, let's be honest, he was seen as more of an extreme exception. Yeah, you know what I mean? And also, the likes of Seo Jung-won and a few other players played in Europe as well at the time. But their careers were all cut short because of how competitive European soccer was compared to the Korean game back home for a lot of these players. So the Korean soccer fans at the time really had to live vicariously through their national team, which is quite depressing if you think about it in a way, because even though they qualified for the World Cup every time during that period in the 80s and the 90s, they never managed to win a game at the tournament.
But still, soccer remained to be, as you said, very popular in Korea. Was there any sort of the infrastructure, and I don't mean by that like number of stadiums or anything like that,
Sure.
but what was sort of the rooted enthusiasm for soccer? Where did that come from?
Yeah, no, like what I said about the 전 조선 축구 대회. Korea's got a pretty rich history in terms of domestic soccer that just hasn't been well documented. Just hasn't been documented well enough for us to know just how popular soccer was in Korea. But it wasn't a professional soccer league at the time, but in 1983, Korea became the first Asian country to launch a professional soccer league, which, eventually became what we call the K-League now. It wasn't called that at the time, but, between when Korea first qualified for the World Cup in 1954 and 1982, Korea couldn't qualify for the World Cup at all. But the professional league really just propelled Korea to become a stronger footballing nation, as our British friends like to call it, because Korea has qualified for every World Cup since they launched their professional league. And soccer is still very much a sport that Koreans use to promote their national identity, and we all know how important that is for a lot of us Koreans, which is quite different to our European counterparts who connect with this sport. I mean, they connect with it nationally too, but it's more of a local identity thing for them. So I think that's one of the big differences. And you mentioned how just why was Korean so drawn to soccer? And a lot of storylines to back that up, I guess, as well. But if I were to share one story, there was a Korean soccer legend, sort of like, we consider him the godfather of Korean football. His name is Kim Yong-sik, and he was the first Korean soccer player to compete in the Olympics. And now that's an interesting story because because I say he's the first Korean soccer player to compete in the Olympics because he preceded the actual Korean team that played in the Olympics because he played for Japan at the 1936 Olympics in Berlin, because at the time, obviously, Korea was colonized at the time.
And then we come to 2002 World Cup, which Korea was able to co-host with Japan. And as a co-host, they didn't have to go through the qualifiers, the qualifying rounds. Can you tell us a little bit about their successful bid to co-host the 2002 World Cup and how the Koreans were preparing for the game?
Yeah, no. So when we talk about the history of this game in Korea, it really broadly breaks down to two different parts, I would say, pre-2002 and post-2002. Because the success of the national team in 2002, it didn't just set the bar high for the national team. It also changed how we consume this sport. And, I just spoke about the difficulties that Korean players had with getting opportunities in Europe, but from the 23 players that played for Korea at the 2002 World Cup, 11 of them ended up playing in Europe at some point in their careers. And even though all of those players have retired now, they're currently either working as coaches or technical directors within Korean soccer. And, think of the, the know-how and the experience and the expectations that they would have when they're dealing with these younger players who probably grew up watching them play. So when you look at it from that perspective, the 2002 World Cup and its legacy, I think it goes well beyond the millions of people in our country just celebrating for 1 month over the success of the national team making it to the semifinals. I think it just changed the landscape completely.
But in order for it to change the landscape, like how did they get there in terms of the co-host, and why did they decide to co-host instead of just hosting on their own? Was there any reasoning behind that?
Well, Korea got lucky to even co-host the tournament because Japan was already in the race and they were pretty much a shoe-in to host the World Cup until Korea came into the picture. And for Korea, it was in the bidding process. I still remember this. Early 90s, it was big news almost every day, headlines every day. And Korea, they joined the race pretty late, but they, impressively enough, they put up a good fight, I guess. And then they were able to win half of the tournament. And so it was co-hosting the tournament. It was almost like, yes, at the time, Koreans were expecting Korea to be the solitary host of the World Cup. But when you look back now and the situations that transpired during the bidding process, Korea was pretty lucky to even be able to co-host the tournament.
Koreans of certain age can never, ever forget that summer of 2002, whether you're a soccer fan or not. And as you mentioned, it totally changed the sort of the soccer profession in Korea forever. What do you think changed after the 2000 World Cup for the Koreans, the non-sport people, people who are just casual fans? What was that experience all about?
I think it changed their mentality in terms of, just living through that period, seeing Korea pulling off upset after upset after upset. I think for all the positives that came with the 2002 World Cup, though, but this is what really confuses me. I do find it still a bit baffling that Korea is still where we are in the global soccer landscape, because if I were to go back in time and think of the expectations for Korea at the World Cup in the early 90s and the late 90s by the general public, it was always about win one game at the World Cup, hope and pray that we go to the round of 16. And, when you look at the World Cup now and you look at how the Korean media and the general public perceives this national team, not a lot has changed. Like from a global standpoint, Korea still isn't a real contender to make it far in the tournament. And that may sound strange when you consider the amount of talent that Korea has now in soccer and how that compares to Korean soccer in the past. But, soccer is such a rapidly growing sport at all times that, and the problem for Korea is that, as much as we have improved as a footballing nation, like I said, there are other countries who've always been in front of Korea in that race that have improved even faster than Korea over the last couple of decades. So competition, like I'm sure as well, competition isn't just about improving yourself. You know what I mean? It's also about finding ways to improve more and to improve faster than your competitors. And that's obviously been very difficult for Korea.
We just talked about how successful they were. So can you walk us through how successful they were during the tournament, like game by game, if possible?
Sure. No, the 2002 World Cup, that was actually the first time Korea was able to win a game at the tournament. And that was actually the first time Korea ever made it out of the group stage at a World Cup. So go to the semifinal. Nobody was able to even imagine. I mean, Korea going to the semifinal of the World Cup, well, that was something that was even not even imaginable. You know what I mean? And it was amazing because for Korea, I think up to that point, until the 1998 World Cup, Korea, they couldn't even get a draw in their first game at a World Cup. Every single time when they qualified, they lost all of their first games. But that World Cup in 2002, it started with a win over Poland, a 2-0 win, and Poland at the time was a very strong team because they were one of the most consistent teams in European qualifying. And they were able to qualify for the 2002 World Cup that way. And for Korea to beat them 2-0. And I still remember watching that game, and it wasn't just a win. Korea looked completely dominant in that game. And I think for the public to see their team, I still remember I watched that game with my mom, and my mom was like, wow, Gus Hiddink really made these players into actual real players. This is nothing like Korea that I've seen in the past. So I think when you look at it from that standpoint, being able to beat Poland in their first game, and then in their last group game, they played against Portugal, who were considered as the contender to win the tournament, and they were able to beat them. And the goal scorer for the winning goal in that game was Park Ji-sung, who obviously went on to even greater things, went to Manchester United, won multiple trophies, went to the 2006 World Cup for Korea, scored that big goal against France where Korea was able to tie France, which is a pretty big accomplishment if you think about it. Went to the 2010 World Cup. He scored a goal in a game that took Korea to the last 16 of the tournament for the first time in history on a foreign soil. So you have Park Ji-sung. You obviously have another star player like An Jong-wan, who became an absolute national superstar after that tournament. And it's not just the players who played in that tournament too. We look at right now. We're looking at players like Son Heung-min, who became a global star really. And in Korea, we call these players, the generation of players that are playing for Korea now at this World Cup, we call them the World Cup kids. Not because they're going to the World Cup, because we know that they grew up watching the 2002 World Cup. Because all these players, they were just about 7, 8, 9, or 10 years old when the 2002 World Cup was happening, and think about how much confidence that must have given them to see Korea lose every time at a World Cup, to hear all these stories from your parents about how Korea can't win a game at a World Cup, to all of a sudden to see them win games and to go to the semifinals of a World Cup that was hosted in their country. That obviously must have been a big factor.
So you mentioned of all the Korean players from the 2002 World Cup team going to European leagues and having very very successful professional careers as well. So how did things started to really change? That sort of the 20 years. I can't believe it's been 20 years, but it's been 20 years since that World Cup. How Korean players are doing all around the world at this point in the both professional leagues, and how has Korea fared in last 20 years for World Cup as a national team?
Right, that's a really funny question, really, because I still remember when Park Ji-sung first went to Manchester United, right? He would score a goal in a game, and nowadays, we're talking about a player like Son Heung-min who wins the Golden Boot in the Premier League, and that's the best league in the world. But at the time when Park Ji-sung went to Manchester United, not only were we shocked that he was able to go to the Premier League, let alone a team like Manchester United. But when he would score a goal against Liverpool, that news would be in the headlines for the next week or 2 weeks. But now, our attitude, like I said, the way we consume the sport has completely changed because we've been sort of spoiled in the sense that when Son Heung-min scores a goal in the Premier League, it's just another day now. And when he doesn't score for 2-3 games, it's almost seen as a crisis because we're so used to seeing him score against the best teams in the world. So that completely changed the way Koreans think about the game, I think. And, back in the day, like even the early 2000s, we would hear about Korean player, joining a team in Turkey, joining a team in Austria, one of like the second tier European league, so to speak. That would be enough to excite a lot of the Korean soccer fans, even the general public. And now we've got a team at this 2022 World Cup. We've got players in all over Europe. We have two players playing in Greece. We've got other players who may not have made the squad this time, but they're playing in leagues like Belgium, Austria, very, very good competitive leagues. And the Koreans aren't content. Their expectation is we want to see Korean players in the top 5 European leagues. That's the expectation now. So I think, through soccer and through seeing the development of Korean soccer over the years, it sort of changed the image of Koreans abroad almost. If that makes sense, because now it's changed so much to a point where Korean players that are playing abroad in Europe or wherever, our expectation is for them to one day end up in the best leagues in the world. And, even right after 2002 World Cup, that was not the expectation. The expectation for Korea was let's go to the World Cup and try to win a game. And now it's about every week, I want to see you play against the best league, against the best players in the world, against the best teams in the world. And we not only expect that, we expect you to perform. So it changed the expectation and the landscape completely.
Then how does that affect K-League, which is Korean's own professional soccer league, if all the best players are expected to go to the bigger and better things? What does that mean to the K-League?
I think you can ask the same question to any country that's outside of the top 5 FIFA rankings or the top 10 FIFA rankings, because that's just the way soccer is set up now. You have a good player, he is Eurobound. It's just that's just the way it is now. But the way these competitive countries, like when you watch the World Cup, we saw what Croatia did in the 2018 World Cup, going all the way to the final as the underdogs. When you look at countries like that, Croatia obviously cannot protect their players from league, cannot prevent their players from going to the bigger leagues in Europe. They don't have the wealth to make that happen. Neither can they stop the will of the players from wanting to play in the biggest leagues in the world. But they've created this pipeline or a system, so to speak, where they can continue to develop talented young players. And so one day they may be leaving the Croatian league to go play for Real Madrid, to go play for Chelsea, to play in the Premier League, the La Liga, and the European Champions League. But they have a system in place where they can develop young players that can replace those players. So that's the aim for Korea, obviously, because we don't expect the K-League to compete with the likes of the Premier League or the European Champions League anytime soon. But the expectation for Korean soccer is to have the infrastructure and to have a professional league in place where they can continue to develop talented young players that can represent Korea.
Then what does it mean for the players to now go to World Cup when they could be having really successful careers wherever in the world? But then every 4 years, you go back to your home country and you get to play with your colleagues. Some of them, maybe you were against each other. And this is not the case just for the Korean team. This is the case for basically every national team that's making it to the World Cup. But what do you think it means for the athletes to compete in a World Cup representing their home country?
Yeah, that's sort of like that's what makes soccer special, because that mystique, that aura that the World Cup has, because you see Lionel Messi playing for the likes of Barcelona and now PSG, I guess, but you don't see him play with the kind of emotion that he plays with when he plays for Argentina. He sort of becomes a different player. And I think that's part of the reason why Argentina has been struggling, because he feels like he's carrying so much pressure on his shoulders. But at the same time, you see Lionel Messi losing a World Cup final, losing a Copa America final, and crying in front of everybody. I've never seen him cry like that when he played for Barcelona, winning trophies or even losing a final. It's just a different kind of feeling when you're playing for your country, especially in soccer. I would want to think that, even in sports like basketball, baseball, it's quite similar, but it's just that soccer, these national team games are just seen differently from other sports. Because when we, in America, we like to talk about the NBA, we like to talk about the NFL and the MLB as well. During a season, for players to join their national team, to fly halfway across the globe and to play for their national team, to play in a friendly game, to prepare for the World Cup that's coming up in a year or 2 years away, and to go back to their teams to resume their seasons. It's almost unthinkable in basketball. It's also completely unthinkable in baseball. But soccer is just seen differently because it's, the tradition of this sport, it's still rooted in the international game. So, when you speak to a player like Son Heung-min, when you speak to other Korean players, even the fact that they're playing in the biggest league in the world, part of their motivation, if not all of it, is for them to improve as players so they can compete at the World Cup. So it's almost seen differently. I mean, obviously, wealth plays a part, money plays a part, fame plays a part. I get all of that, but still being able to go to a European team, to hone your skills there, to develop as a player and to improve there, to be able to help your national team is still a very big part for all these soccer players.
And let's speak a little bit about the coaches. As you said, there are all these kids who are players before who became coaches, who are influenced by the coaches who were brought in. And going back to the 2002, was that the first time Korea has non-Korean coaching the national team? Or
you mean in 2002?
Mm-hmm.
Well, before that, Korea has had a couple of foreign coaches as well, accomplished foreign coaches, but not to the level of Gus Hiddink. Because when we're talking about Gus Hiddink, we're talking about a manager who's been in charge of Real Madrid, who's been in charge of the Dutch national team, and even after leaving Korea in 2002, he went on to do even bigger things with more big teams in the world. He managed Chelsea. He went to the Champions League semifinal with PSV Eindhoven. So that wasn't the first time, but it was a first time for a coach of Gus Hiddink's profile to arrive in Korea. And that was just about the only time as well, because, after 2002 World Cup, obviously Korea has hired quite a few foreign soccer coaches as well. There were a few decent ones amongst them as well, but it was for 2002 was just a special occasion, to be completely honest with you. They had the support of the government as well, to go out to invest and to really just do whatever it is that they needed to do to improve the national team to be able to compete at the World Cup in 2002. Now it's a little bit different. And I'm not trying to say that Paulo Bento is not a qualified coach. He very well is. He's somebody who was the national team manager for Portugal, took them to the World Cup, took them to the semifinals of the European Championship as well. So, but it's just a little different. When Hiddink arrived in Korea, it was just seen differently because here's a head coach who was in charge of a team like Real Madrid arriving in Korea. Even to this day, that would be a big shock. So you can only imagine 20 years ago, that was a complete shock.
And you just mentioned Paulo Bento, who is the coach for the 2022 Korean national team. And he actually has a little history with 2002 World Cup as well, doesn't he?
Right. So he was one of the main players for Portugal. Playing the Portuguese team that played against Korea in the 2002 World Cup. Both teams went into that game with everything on the line. They needed to get something out of that game to be able to advance to the round of 16. And, famously, Korea was able to beat Portugal, who were one of the best teams in the world at the time. And, when we talk about that Portuguese team, a lot of people talk about Luis Figo. A lot of people talk about Rui Costa, obviously world-class, amazing players. But Paulo Bento was sort of the guy who played behind them to provide support. He was that dirty worker in midfield. But it's funny because when you go back and look at the highlights of that game, he was the very player who stood in front of the Korean player Lee Young-pyo, who played that cross to assist the goal. So it's really funny how that works. 20 years later, who would have known that he would be the head coach for Korea?
And they're also meeting Portugal in the the
Right.
first round, right? They're in the
Right.
group,
Right.
with the group together.
Right.
I'm sure that will be a very emotional game for everybody.
Yeah.
So give us, other than Paul, give us a little preview of the Paulo Bento's team. Obviously, when I told people that we're doing this program, a lot of the soccer fans, their biggest concern was Son Heung-min and whether he will be able to play or not. So can you give us a little preview of what had happened for Korea's journey to this World Cup?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of Son Heung-min, he's carrying that injury on his face, obviously still. But based on what I'm hearing, it's looking pretty promising for him to start against Uruguay on November 24th. So I think that's a really promising news for Korea. But we were talking about Paulo Bento, and I think that plays a big part when we're talking about Korea at this World Cup, because this is actually the very first time the Korean national team is going to a World Cup without replacing their head coach for the last 4 years. So we call every World Cup, there's a cycle of 4 years that you prepare for every World Cup. And Korea, between 2010 and 2018, during those 8 years, Korea changed their head coach 6 times. And since 2018 till today, it's been all under Paulo Bento. And you may look at that and be like, okay, so what difference does that really make on the players? But you got to think about, when you talk to a European soccer fan, when you talk to a South American soccer fan, they talk about things like having a football philosophy, having a consistency and stability so you can build a successful team that can compete at the World Cup. But, you change coaches 6 times in the span of 8 years. You can only imagine what kind of stability you're going to end up with. And for Korea are considered as underdogs to start with. And for Korea to go to the World Cup, to play against teams like Mexico, to play against teams like Sweden, Germany, Belgium, Russia, teams like that, to go to a World Cup under a coach who's only been in charge for 8 months, 10 months, 1 year. That's the way it's been for Korea in 2014 and 2018. And we all saw what happened. And obviously that famous 2-0 win over Germany last World Cup was a very, very famous win. I understand that. But when you look at the way Korea had to play in that game, I mean, I don't even think I have to get much further into that. But, for Korea to finally have the stability of being led by one head coach for 4 years, to have that stability to going into a World Cup, for the players to know exactly how they should be playing, for players to know exactly what the coach is expecting, for players to have played together in the same system for 4 years to go to the World Cup, their confidence is through the roof right now. And we'll see if that's good enough. That's going to be good enough to take Korea into the next round of the World Cup. But it's never looked this promising over the last decade or so. So I think we can have high hopes comparatively, compared to the past.
So other than Son Heung-min, who is obviously the superstar and the most well-known Korean soccer player of right now, who are the other players that we should look out for?
I'm sure a lot of even the general public is aware of him by now. Kim Min-jae is one of the star players for Korea. The best defender this season in the Italian Serie A, which is really, really impressive because, like I said, that's one of the top five European leagues, and he's playing for a team that's first place in the league right now, Napoli. And he's competing in the Champions League, playing against teams like Liverpool, beating them 3-0. So he's obviously the next star in line for Korea. If not, he's probably already a star in Korea. If I were to talk about other players, we're talking about Hwang Hee-chan, who's another player that's playing in the English Premier League. And if I were to give you more names, there's a player by the name of Hwang In-bum who's playing in Greece, one of the most talented midfielders that Korea has ever had. We're already hearing talks about how he could go to Germany after the World Cup in the winter, which I have my doubts because he actually just joined this team in Greece. So it's only been about a few months since he joined this new team. So we'll just have to wait and see what's in store for him. But yeah, a ton of talent for Korea, and how they compare to these European teams, South American teams that Korea will be playing against, we're just going to have to wait and see. But, we also look at a player like Hwang Hee-jo, who until last season played in France. He's the all-time leading Asian goal scorer in the French league, scored, I believe, close to 30 goals there over 2-3 seasons. So a ton of talent for Korea. Korea's squad has never been this talented, probably since 2010 when they were able to make it past the group stage for the first time in history outside of Korea. And I think if Korea ever had their chance to kind of replicate that success, this World Cup's going to have to be it.
Well, we'll have to wait and see what happens. So when you talk about all these amazing talents and the fierce competitiveness of it all, and sometimes how it just seems like almost impossible to actually think that they will win any game because they are, you think they are good, but they're always somebody who's better. But it is still sports, right? You either win or lose. We don't like to use the word winners or losers anymore these days, but that is the reality of the game.
Right.
And so realistically speaking, Korea making it, this appearance at the World Cup is exciting enough. And that's why people are all excited about it. But how do we handle this idea that, maybe you're not quite good enough, or what it takes is the miracle of the 20 years ago to really reach that high, and maybe we'll never feel that again? As a soccer fan, how do you deal with the sort of the realistic expectation and the fantasy that you have for the Korean team?
Well, I mean, starting with this World Cup, Korea's in the same group as Uruguay and Portugal. And Ghana is a tough opponent on their own right as well. But when we talk about Uruguay and Portugal, these are teams that are expected to win the World Cup, or at least be able to make a deep run into the tournament, quarterfinals or semifinals. Anything less than that would be a disaster for them. And for Korea to go up against them, we've got, out of all the World Cups that we've been to, only 2 World Cups were able to make it out of the group stage. And just to relay the thinking behind the players, I was interviewing a player. I was interviewing Hwang In-bum a couple of weeks ago, with only a month to go until the game against Uruguay. I interviewed him last month. And what he told me was, we're going to do everything we can to put ourselves in a position where we can hope for a miracle. Word for word, that's what he said. We're going to do everything we can. I cannot promise our fans that we can win. I cannot promise our fans that we can make it out of the group stage. But what I can promise is that we won't be wasting a minute or even a second of our time over the course of 270 minutes that we'll be playing at the World Cup, at least, because they're going to be playing 3 games, 90 minutes. We will not waste 1 second of the 270 minutes just lollygagging. And I think that's the realistic expectation for Korea, to go out there, to put everything on the line, to play your best, and we'll see what happens. Because you can play a great game. Soccer is a funny game. It's a game where you can play well for 90 minutes and you can still lose by a goal. So, we always talk about the Netherlands, one of the best teams in the world, contenders to win the World Cup at every World Cup. They didn't even make it to the tournament in 2018. So, for Koreans to go to the World Cup and to assume that it's going to be a given for us to win a game, it's going to be a given for us to make it past the group stage, it just doesn't add up, really.
But at the same time, we can always hope.
Of course.
For that, what was the famous photo from 2002 when they were playing against Italy? They had the stadium had the placard that says again 1966.
Oh, again 1966, right?
And so maybe again 2002. But we'll see what happens. Other than Korea, what are you looking forward to at this World Cup? Any particular team that you're very interested or you're looking forward to watching?
I was asked the same question before the World Cup actually started, and I picked Ecuador as one of my surprise teams of the tournament because, and as you saw yesterday, they won their opening game against the hosts, which is never an easy thing to do. We can sit back here and say, oh, Qatar, they've never been to the World Cup, it must be easy to beat them. But to play a tournament opening game against a home team and to be able to beat them that dominantly, it was very, very impressive. But even before that, I was expecting Ecuador to be one of the surprise teams, because when you take a look at their head coach, Gustavo Alfaro, that's a man who knows how to build a team. And when we look at Ecuador of the past, when we look at Ecuador in previous World Cups, that was a graded team that played very defensively. So a general public might see their game and say, hey, this team's really boring. But when you look at their team now under their head coach, this is one of the most entertaining teams at the World Cup now. They've got youth, but they've also got experience. They've got the technical talents, and they still have that grit about them. So I still think the win against Qatar is not the end for them. I think I think they have the capability to make a deep run in the tournament. So if I have to pick one team to make a surprise run deep into the tournament, my choice would be Ecuador. Another storyline that I would be looking at is, can Lionel Messi finally win his World Cup? And this is going to be his last tournament. This is going to be it. He's already 35 years old, so we cannot foresee another World Cup for him. So, and Argentina, they are stronger than they've ever been ever since Messi started his national team career. So can this be finally Messi's chance to win a World Cup? Because that's been, for a player who's won over 30 trophies in his career at club level, his hope and dream is still to win the World Cup for Argentina. And this is a guy who's left Argentina when he was about 11 years old. So that's a big storyline. This is going to be Cristiano Ronaldo's last World Cup. Can he finally win a World Cup for Portugal, which he was never able to do? So a lot of interesting storylines, and the tournament is we're just 2 days into the tournament now. So, we're just going to have to wait and see how this thing unfolds. But yeah, a lot in store for a lot of the soccer fans around the world.
And on that note, maybe we'll see you again in 4 years for the 2026 World Cup.
Yeah, I'll be happy to be back.
Hopefully Korea will be back for the tournament. But thank you again for taking your time to joining us tonight. We wish you all the best and stay healthy while you're going to be very, very busy for next few weeks. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. This was great.